At midnight in 1871 London, a duke hands his pregnant mistress a priceless ruby and orders her to vanish before his wife discovers the affair. But when 7 people burn alive in a Boston boarding house 6 years later, the banished woman realizes someone wants her dead, and they're coming back to finish the job.
Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, like the video and share with loved ones, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin.
In the marble hallway of the Thornhill London townhouse, at 2 o'clock in the morning on September 17, 1871, Andrew Dane, Duke of Thornhill, pressed a small leather box into Sallie Eden's trembling hands. The gas lamps had been dimmed throughout the house, leaving only the single candle he carried to illuminate their faces. Inside the box, the Thornhill Rose ring glowed like a drop of blood, a ruby so flawless it had once belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. "Take this ring and disappear," he instructed, his voice flat, emotionless, the voice of a man making a business transaction rather than destroying the woman who loved him. "Before my wife discovers you're carrying my heir." Sallie, 22 years old and 3 months pregnant, stared at the ring, then at the man she believed would marry her once his cold, loveless union with the Duchess inevitably ended. She'd been in England for 18 months, ward to a duke who'd promised her dead father, Captain Robert Eden of the Boston Merchant Marine, that he'd protect his only daughter. Protection had turned to flirtation in the library, flirtation to stolen meetings in the rose garden, stolen meetings to the kind of reckless passion that ruins lives. Now he was handing her a ring and a thick envelope of bank notes like severance pay for a dismissed servant. Andrew. Her voice broke on his name. The American accent she'd tried so hard to soften suddenly pronounced in her distress. "You'll go back to Boston," he continued, not meeting her eyes, staring instead at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "You'll tell people you were briefly married to an Englishman who died. The child will have a father's name on the birth certificate. Invent whatever you like. I'll arrange for £500 annually to be sent through my solicitor, Bartholomew Wright. You'll live comfortably, quietly, respectably." He paused, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were gray, cold as winter fog over the Thames. "But you must never contact me, never speak of this to anyone, never return to England. Do you understand? You disappear completely, Sallie. As far as society is concerned, Miss Eden returned to America due to homesickness. Nothing more. What if the child is a son?" Sallie whispered, one hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "Your heir, a legitimate claim." "I have no heir." Andrew cut her off, his voice hardening. "I have an American ward who got herself into trouble and whom I'm generously helping to resettle. That's the only story that exists. My marriage to Aubrey is essential. Her family controls railway investments worth hundreds of thousands. My estates are mortgaged. I will not, risk everything for a moment of weakness." The words hit Sallie like physical blows. A moment of weakness. 3 months ago, in the rose garden, he'd whispered that he loved her, that he'd find a way to end his barren marriage to the ice-cold Duchess. She believed him. She looked down at the ring in her palm, at the envelope of money. £5,000. She could see through the paper. Blood money. Silence money. "The ship leaves from Liverpool on September 20th, Andrew said, pulling a ticket from his jacket. "First-class passage. I've arranged everything. My driver will take you to the station tomorrow before dawn. No one will see you leave." Behind him, in the darkness at the top of the grand staircase, neither of them noticed the shadow that listened. Aubrey Dane, Duchess of Thornhill, stood motionless in her silk dressing gown, one pale hand gripping the banister. Her face, beautiful and cold as a porcelain mask, showed no emotion as she watched her husband give away a priceless family heirloom to his pregnant mistress. But her mind was already calculating. The ring, the child, the threats to everything she'd built, everything she controlled. They would all need to be eliminated. Sallie left England on September 20th, 1871, sailing from Liverpool to Boston with the Thornhill Rose sewn into the hem of her traveling cloak and a broken heart she would carry for 10 years. She believed she was escaping scandal and shame, beginning a quiet life as a respectable widow. She had no idea she was running for her life. 3 months after Sallie's departure, on a cold December morning in 1871, Aubrey Dane discovered the truth in the most mundane way possible. Andrew's valet, old Thomas Ferris, had been clearing out the Duke's study when a crumpled letter fell from behind a drawer, a letter in feminine handwriting, dated August 1871, discussing morning sickness and fear of discovery. Aubrey found Thomas holding the letter with shaking hands, debating whether to burn it or present it to his master. She took it from him with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll ensure His Grace receives this." She read it 3 times in her private sitting room, each word stoking a fury she kept perfectly controlled beneath her porcelain exterior. The pregnancy, the promised payments, the American ward sent away with promises of support, and most infuriating, the mention of the ring he gave me, the one from his grandmother's collection. Aubrey knew exactly which ring. The Thornhill Rose, a ruby worth £5,000, an heirloom that belonged to the estate, her estate, through 16 years of marriage to this weak, sentimental fool. But fury gave way to calculation. Aubrey hadn't risen from minor gentry to Duchess by acting on emotion. She was the daughter of railroad magnate Lord Edmund Kensington, a woman who'd learned early that power came through control, manipulation, and the systematic elimination of threats. And this bastard child was a threat. Aubrey had spent 16 years hiding a devastating secret. She was barren. A childhood illness had left her unable to conceive, something she'd discovered only after her marriage to Andrew. She'd blamed him, of course, whispered to doctors about his weak constitution, made sure society believed the childlessness was his failure, not hers. If Andrew had a child, even illegitimate, it complicated everything. Succession, control, the careful web of financial arrangements she'd built through her family's railway investments. Investments that kept Andrew's mortgaged estates afloat while ensuring she maintained real power. She summoned her personal solicitor, a cold-eyed man named Vincent Hale, who specialized in problems requiring discretion. "I need information," she said, sliding Sally's letter across the mahogany desk. "This woman, find her in Boston. Learn everything. Where she lives, how she survives, who knows about the child. And I need it done quietly." Within 6 weeks, Hale reported back. Miss Sallie Eden, now calling herself Mrs. Sarah Eden, claiming widowhood, living in a modest boarding house in Boston's South End. A daughter born February 14, 1872, named Clara, living on annual payments of £500 arranged through the Duke's solicitor, Bartholomew Wright. Aubrey's smile was arctic. "Mr. Wright handles these payments personally?" "Yes, Your Grace." His Grace signed the authorization but leaves the actual transfers to Wright's discretion. How convenient. Aubrey leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. And if those payments were to cease? If Mr. Wright were to continue reporting to His Grace that payments were made, while actually keeping the funds himself? Hill's expression didn't change. "Mr. Wright has significant gambling debts, Your Grace. He might be amenable to such an arrangement for the right price." "Arrange it. The American woman's payments stop immediately. But my husband must never know." The payments stopped in March 1872. Sallie, nursing baby Clara in her Boston boarding house, waited anxiously for the bank draft that never came. She wrote to Bartholomew Wright, letters that were intercepted and destroyed. By summer, she was desperate, taking work as a seamstress, her savings dwindling rapidly. In London, Aubrey began the second phase of her plan, eliminating witnesses. Thomas Ferris, the elderly valet who'd found the letter, knew too much. On a fog-thick November evening in 1873, as Thomas descended the townhouse's main staircase carrying fresh linens, he encountered the Duchess on the landing. "Thomas, a word about His Grace's correspondence." What happened next was over in seconds. A stumble, a cry, the sickening sound of an old man's body tumbling down marble stairs. Thomas lay at the bottom, neck bent at an impossible angle, eyes staring at nothing. Aubrey stood at the top, one hand on the banister, her face arranged in perfect shock as servants came running. "He missed his step," she said, her voice trembling convincingly. "Oh God, he just missed his step. Someone fetch a doctor, quickly." The inquest ruled it an accidental death. An elderly servant, failing eyesight, tragic but not uncommon. Andrew attended the funeral, guilt-stricken, generous with the pension for Thomas's widow. He never suspected. In Boston, Sallie Eden struggled through her first winter of real poverty, unaware that a woman she'd never met was systematically destroying everyone who knew her secret. The Duchess's rage was patient, methodical, and absolutely lethal. By early 1874, Aubrey had refined her methods. Thomas Ferris's death had taught her the value of patience and plausible accidents. Now she turned her attention to the second witness, Jonathan Harding, Andrew's former private secretary, who had once delivered a sealed letter to Miss Eden at the Duke's request. Jonathan was young, ambitious, recently married, with an infant son. He'd left the Duke's employ for a position at the Foreign Office, a better opportunity, better pay. But he remembered the American ward, remembered the whispered meetings, the letters he'd been asked not to mention to the Duchess. Vincent Hale tracked him easily. Jonathan lived in Clerkenwell, walked home from the Foreign Office every evening along the embankment, often stopping at the same riverside tavern for a pint before continuing home to his wife. On a rainy March evening in 1874, Jonathan Harding left that tavern slightly drunk, as he often did on Fridays. The Thames was high and fast, swollen with spring rains. The embankment walkway was slick with wet leaves. A figure in a dark coat approached him near Blackfriars Bridge. "Mr. Harding? A message from the Duke of Thornhill. Urgent matter regarding your discretion." Jonathan turned, squinting through the rain. "What message? I don't understand." The figure moved fast. A hard shove, perfectly timed as Jonathan stood at the railing's edge. He went over backward, his scream cut short as the black water swallowed him. His body was found 3 days later, tangled in the pilings at Tower Bridge. The inquest heard testimony about his drinking, the slippery conditions, the dangerous river. Accidental death by drowning. His widow received a sympathy letter from the Duchess of Thornhill and a generous donation toward the infant's care. Andrew attended that funeral too, shaken by the loss of a man he'd valued. 2 deaths in 6 months, he said to Aubrey that evening. Thomas, and now poor Harding. It makes one think about mortality. Indeed, Aubrey replied, pouring his brandy with steady hands. Life is terribly fragile. We must be grateful for what we have. Across the Atlantic, Sally's life was unraveling. The promised payments had never resumed. Her letters to the solicitor went unanswered. Her savings were gone. The boarding house room she'd afforded in the South End was now impossible. She moved to a cheaper place in the North End, then cheaper still. By spring 1875, she was working 14-hour days in a textile factory, her hands bleeding from the looms, her lungs choked with cotton dust. 3-year-old Clara stayed with a neighbor woman who watched 5 children in a one-room apartment, feeding them watered-down porridge and keeping them quiet with threats. At night, Sallie would hold Clara in their cramped room, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, and feel the Thornhill Rose ring hidden in the hem of her one good dress. She'd never been able to sell it, partly because it was too recognizable, too valuable. Any jeweler would ask questions, but mostly because looking at it fed her rage, kept her anger sharp and burning. "Your father gave me this," she'd whispered to sleeping Clara, "and told me to disappear. He thought money and jewelry could erase us. But we're still here. We're still fighting. And someday, somehow, he'll know we didn't just vanish." She had no idea that survival itself was an act of defiance against a woman who'd already killed twice to erase her existence. Vincent Hale reported to Aubrey in May 1875, "The Eden woman is destitute, Your Grace. Living in squalor, working factory hours. She won't last another winter at this rate. The problem may resolve itself naturally." Aubrey's smile was thin. "Nature is unreliable, Mr. Hale. I prefer certainty. Contact Roy Sutton in Boston, the investigator we used before. Tell him it's time to finish this permanently. And tell him I want that ring back." In a Boston factory, Sallie Eden coughed cotton dust and tried not to think about how much thinner Clara had gotten. Neither of them heard the clock ticking down to fire and murder. If this story is gripping you, if you're desperate to know whether Sallie and Clara survive what's coming, subscribe now. Because what happens next, the fire, the confrontation, the moment Sallie realizes someone wants her dead, will leave you breathless. Don't miss a single moment. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the rest of this impossible journey. Roy Sutton arrived in Boston in late August 1875 with clear instructions from Vincent Hale. Eliminate the problem, retrieve the ring, make it look like an accident. He was a large man, thick-shouldered and cold-eyed, who'd made a career of solving problems for wealthy people who couldn't afford scandals. He tracked Sallie to a 3-story wooden boarding house in the North End, a fire trap packed with Irish immigrants, Italian laborers, and factory workers too poor for anything better. 23 people lived there, sharing 4 washrooms and a single kitchen. The hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and unwashed bodies. The walls were so thin you could hear neighbors breathing. Roy watched the building for 2 weeks, learning routines. Sallie left for the factory at 5:30 every morning, returned at 8 every evening, exhausted and hollow-eyed. The child, Clara, age 3, stayed with a neighbor woman on the 2nd floor during the day. At night, mother and daughter disappeared into their 3rd-floor room and didn't emerge until dawn. On September 14, 1875, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Roy Sutton entered the boarding house through the basement coal chute. He'd brought kerosene, rags, matches. He worked methodically, soaking the wooden stairwell, the 1st-floor hallways, ensuring the flames would spread fast and block the main exits. He lit the fire in 3 places simultaneously. Then he positioned himself in the 2nd-floor hallway, watching the stairs, waiting. Sallie woke to Clara's screaming. Smoke was already thick in their room, seeping under the door, choking in black. She grabbed Clara, wrapped her in a blanket, and kicked open the door. The hallway was hell. Flames roared up the stairwell. People were screaming. Someone was pounding on walls. Sallie could see the main staircase, completely engulfed, impassable. The back stairs, her only chance. She ran toward them, Clara clutching her neck, both of them coughing violently. And then she saw him. A man's silhouette stood at the top of the back stairs, not moving, not helping, just watching. Backlit by flames, his features were obscured, but Sallie felt his eyes on her, calculating, waiting. Their gazes locked for one impossible moment. Then Roy Sutton tipped his hat in a slow, mocking gesture and stepped aside. "Window," he said quietly, pointing to the landing window. "You want to live? Use the window." Sallie didn't hesitate. She smashed the window with her elbow, feeling glass slice her arm, and climbed onto the fire escape with Clara. Behind them, she heard Roy's footsteps descending calmly, unhurried, as people burned and screamed. They made it to the ground as the building's roof collapsed. Neighbors were running with buckets, but it was too late. The boarding house was a tower of flame against the night sky. By morning, 7 people were dead. Mrs. O'Brien, the elderly Irish landlady who'd let Sallie pay rent late when Clara was sick. The Moretti family, parents and 4 children under age 8, who'd shared their Sunday dinners when Sallie had nothing. A young factory worker named James who'd walked Sallie home on dark nights to keep her safe. Sallie sat on the curb, Clara in her lap, watching the smoking ruins. Everything was gone except the carpet bag she'd managed to grab, the one containing her few possessions, and, sewn into the lining, the Thornhill Rose ring. A police officer approached. "Ma'am, do you know how the fire started?" Sallie looked at him, seeing Roy Sutton's silhouette in her mind, that mocking tip of the hat. She understood now with perfect clarity. Someone wanted her dead. Not robbed. Not frightened. Dead. And it had something to do with that ring and the man who'd given it to her. "No," she lied, holding Clara tighter. "I don't know." But she knew enough. She knew Andrew Dane's dismissal hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of a hunt. And she knew that whoever was hunting her had just murdered 7 innocent people to get to her. That afternoon, Sallie Eden ceased to exist. She became Sarah Eden, moved to a rough Irish neighborhood in South Boston where people didn't ask questions, and took work in a textile factory under a false name. She told Clara they were hiding from bad men, and Clara, only 3 but already wise beyond her years, learned to be silent, watchful, afraid. The Thornhill Rose ring stayed hidden in that carpet bag, wrapped in cloth, sewn into a secret pocket. Sallie couldn't sell it. It was too recognizable, too dangerous. But she kept it anyway, evidence of the man who'd condemned her and the woman who wanted her erased. In London, Roy Sutton reported to Vincent Hale, problem solved. Building burned completely. No survivors from the 3rd floor. Aubrey received the news with satisfaction. And the ring. Lost in the fire, Your Grace. Nothing survived. Aubrey didn't entirely believe him, but it didn't matter. The American woman was dead, The bastard child was dead. The threat was eliminated. She could finally stop looking over her shoulder. She had no idea that Sallie Eden was very much alive, hiding in plain sight, raising a daughter who would someday learn exactly who tried to kill them and why. The hunt wasn't over. It had simply gone underground. 6 years of hiding had worn Sallie down to something harder and sharper than the girl who'd fled England. She was 32 years old, but looked 40, her hands permanently scarred from factory work, her lungs damaged from cotton dust and smoke inhalation. She worked 12-hour shifts at the Lowell Textile Mill in South Boston, came home to their single room in a tenement building where rats outnumbered residents, and counted every penny. Clara, now 9 years old, had grown up believing they were running from debt collectors, dangerous men her mother owed money to back when they'd lived in a nicer neighborhood. She didn't know about dukes or duchesses, about ruby rings or English estates. She only knew poverty, fear, and her mother's fierce, desperate love. In October 1881, Clara collapsed at the charity school she attended 3 days a week. The fever came fast and brutal, scarlet fever, the doctor said, spreading through the tenements like wildfire. Without proper treatment, isolation, and medicine, she had perhaps 2 weeks. The medicine cost $12. Sallie had 3. For 2 days, Sallie tried everything. She begged the factory foreman for an advance, denied. She approached a moneylender. The interest would have crushed them even if they survived. She sold everything they owned except the clothes on their backs and Clara's one beloved doll. It wasn't enough. On the 3rd day, Clara's fever spiked so high she began hallucinating, crying out for water, for her mother, for the pain to stop. Sallie held her daughter's burning body and made a decision she'd sworn never to make. She unwrapped the Thornhill Rose ring from its hiding place. The next morning, Sallie walked into Goldstein's fine jewelry on Washington Street, the most reputable jeweler in Boston, a man known for fair dealing and discretion. She placed the ring on his counter with shaking hands. "I need to sell this. Quickly." Jacob Goldstein picked up the ring with practiced fingers, then froze. He'd been in the jewelry business for 40 years. He knew quality, he knew history, and he knew, without question, that he was holding one of the most famous rubies in existence. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "where did you acquire this piece?" "It was a gift," Sallie said, which was technically true. "I need money for my daughter's medicine. She's dying. Please, name a price." Goldstein studied her, the desperation in her eyes, the factory-scarred hands, the mended dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Then he looked at the ring again, at the distinctive rose-cut setting, the flawless Burmese ruby that had once belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine. "This is the Thornhill Rose," he said quietly. "It belongs to the Duke of Thornhill in England. It's been in his family for 300 years. Sallie's face went white. "I didn't steal it. It was given to me. Please, my daughter." "I believe you," Goldstein interrupted. "But ma'am, I can't buy this ring. If I do, I become complicit in whatever story surrounds it. What I can do is loan you $20 against it, and I can contact the proper authorities in England to verify ownership." "No." Sallie reached for the ring, but Goldstein had already pulled it back. "I'm sorry. This is worth thousands. I have to report it." Sallie stumbled out of the shop without the ring, without the money, without hope. She made it 2 blocks before collapsing against a brick wall, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. She'd condemned them both. By trying to save Clara, she'd revealed they were alive. Whoever had tried to kill them 6 years ago, whoever had burned 7 people alive, would know now that they'd failed. Within a week, Jacob Goldstein had contacted the British consulate in Boston. Within 2 weeks, word had traveled through official channels to London. Within 3 weeks, 2 very different people learned that Sallie Eden was alive. In London, Vincent Hale brought the news to Aubrey Dane with barely concealed alarm. "Your Grace, the American woman, she's alive. She tried to sell the Thornhill Rose in Boston." The jeweler reported it to authorities. Aubrey's teacup didn't tremble, but her knuckles went white around the handle. "Roy Sutton told us she was dead." "Apparently not, Your Grace. The child too, sick with fever, but alive." Aubrey set down the teacup with precise care. "Send Sutton back. Immediately. Tell him to finish what he started 6 years ago, and this time, I want proof. And give me that ring." Across London, in a modest office near Lincoln's Inn, Peter Ashford, The Duke's new solicitor, hired after Bartholomew Wright's sudden death from a heart attack, was reviewing estate accounts when he noticed something troubling. Annual payments of £500, authorized by the Duke in 1871, supposedly continuing for 10 years. But the bank records showed the payments had stopped in 1872. Someone had been embezzling. Someone had been lying to the Duke for 9 years. And now Peter had received an unusual inquiry from the British consulate. Did the Duke of Thornhill wish to reclaim a family heirloom currently in possession of Boston authorities, found in the possession of one Mrs. Sallie Eden? Peter looked at the old authorization letter, signed by Andrew Dane, arranging payments to Miss Sallie Eden in Boston. Sarah Eden. Sallie Eden. Peter reached for his coat. The Duke needed to know his mistress and his daughter were alive, and that someone had been systematically destroying them for a decade. 6 years of hiding had worn Sallie down to something harder and sharper than the girl who'd fled England. She was 32 years old, but looked 40, her hands permanently scarred from factory work, her lungs damaged from cotton dust and smoke inhalation. She worked 12-hour shifts at the Lowell Textile Mill in South Boston, came home to their single room in a tenement building where rats outnumbered residents, and counted every penny. Clara, now 9 years old, had grown up believing they were running from debt collectors, dangerous men her mother owed money to back when they'd lived in a nicer neighborhood. She didn't know about dukes or duchesses, about ruby rings or English estates. She only knew poverty, fear, and her mother's fierce, desperate love. In October 1881, Clara collapsed at the charity school she attended 3 days a week. The fever came fast and brutal, scarlet fever, the doctor said, spreading through the tenements like wildfire. Without proper treatment, isolation, and medicine, she had perhaps 2 weeks. The medicine cost $12. Sallie had 3. For 2 days, Sallie tried everything. She begged the factory foreman for an advance, denied. She approached a moneylender. The interest would have crushed them even if they survived. She sold everything they owned except the clothes on their backs and Clara's one beloved doll. It wasn't enough. On the 3rd day, Clara's fever spiked so high she began hallucinating, crying out for water, for her mother, for the pain to stop. Sallie held her daughter's burning body and made a decision she'd sworn never to make. She unwrapped the Thornhill Rose ring from its hiding place. The next morning, Sallie walked into Goldstein's fine jewelry on Washington Street, the most reputable jeweler in Boston, a man known for fair dealing and discretion. She placed the ring on his counter with shaking hands. "I need to sell this. Quickly." Jacob Goldstein picked up the ring with practiced fingers, then froze. He'd been in the jewelry business for 40 years. He knew quality. He knew history. And he knew, without question, that he was holding one of the most famous rubies in existence. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "where did you acquire this piece?" "It was a gift," Sallie said, which was technically true. "I need money for my daughter's medicine. She's dying. Please, name a price." Goldstein studied her, the desperation in her eyes, the factory-scarred hands, the mended dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Then he looked at the ring again, at the distinctive rose-cut setting, the flawless Burmese ruby that had once belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine. "This is the Thornhill Rose," he said quietly. "It belongs to the Duke of Thornhill in England. It's been in his family for 300 years. Sallie's face went white. "I didn't steal it. It was given to me. Please, my daughter." "I believe you," Goldstein interrupted. "But ma'am, I can't buy this ring. If I do, I become complicit in whatever story surrounds it. What I can do is loan you $20 against it, and I can contact the proper authorities in England to verify ownership." "No." Sallie reached for the ring, but Goldstein had already pulled it back. "I'm sorry. This is worth thousands. I have to report it." Sallie stumbled out of the shop without the ring, without the money, without hope. She made it 2 blocks before collapsing against a brick wall, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. She'd condemned them both. By trying to save Clara, she'd revealed they were alive. Whoever had tried to kill them 6 years ago, whoever had burned 7 people alive, would know now that they'd failed. Within a week, Jacob Goldstein had contacted the British consulate in Boston. Within 2 weeks, word had traveled through official channels to London. Within 3 weeks, 2 very different people learned that Sallie Eden was alive. In London, Vincent Hale brought the news to Aubrey Dane with barely concealed alarm. "Your Grace, the American woman, she's alive. She tried to sell the Thornhill Rose in Boston." The jeweler reported it to authorities. Aubrey's teacup didn't tremble, but her knuckles went white around the handle. "Roy Sutton told us she was dead." "Apparently not, Your Grace. The child too, sick with fever, but alive." Aubrey set down the teacup with precise care. "Send Sutton back. Immediately. Tell him to finish what he started 6 years ago, and this time, I want proof. And give me that ring." Across London, in a modest office near Lincoln's Inn, Peter Ashford, the Duke's new solicitor, hired after Bartholomew Wright's sudden death from a heart attack, was reviewing estate accounts when he noticed something troubling. Annual payments of £500, authorized by the Duke in 1871, supposedly continuing for 10 years. But the bank records showed the payments had stopped in 1872. Someone had been embezzling. Someone had been lying to the Duke for 9 years. And now Peter had received an unusual inquiry from the British consulate. Did the Duke of Thornhill wish to reclaim a family heirloom currently in possession of Boston authorities, found in the possession of one Mrs. Sarah Eden? Peter looked at the old authorization letter, signed by Andrew Dane, arranging payments to Miss Sallie Eden in Boston. Sarah Eden. Sallie Eden. Peter reached for his coat. The Duke needed to know his mistress and his daughter were alive, and that someone had been systematically destroying them for a decade. Peter Ashford found Andrew Dane in the Thornhill Manor library, reviewing agricultural reports with the resigned expression of a man going through motions he no longer believed in. At 45, the Duke looked older, graying at the temples, lines of disappointment carved deep around his mouth. His marriage to Aubrey was cold formality. His political career had never recovered from vague scandals he couldn't quite trace, and he'd spent 10 years believing he'd at least done one decent thing, ensuring Sallie Eden and his child lived comfortably in Boston. "Your Grace," Peter said, closing the door behind him. "We need to speak about Miss Sallie Eden." Andrew's head snapped up. "That name is not to be mentioned in this house. The payments stopped in 1872, Your Grace. Your former solicitor, Bartholomew Wright, embezzled the funds." He reported they continued, "But Miss Eden hasn't received a penny in 9 years." The blood drained from Andrew's face. "That's impossible. Wright handled it personally. He assured me. Wright is dead, Your Grace. And Miss Eden is destitute, working in a factory in South Boston under the name Sarah Eden. Your daughter is 9 years old and currently dying of scarlet fever because Miss Eden couldn't afford medicine." Andrew stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. "My daughter. I have a daughter. Clara. Born February 1872. And Your Grace, there's more." Peter laid out the evidence methodically. The stopped payments, the suspicious deaths of Thomas Ferris and Jonathan Harding, bank records showing funds from the Duchess's private accounts to Vincent Hale, and Hale's payments to an American investigator named Roy Sutton. The boarding house fire in Boston in 1875, Peter continued. 7 people died. The authorities ruled it accidental, but Miss Eden was the target. She survived and went into hiding. And now that she's resurfaced, I believe the Duchess will try again. Andrew sank into his chair, his face ashen. "Aubrey wouldn't. She couldn't. Your Grace, I believe your wife has been systematically eliminating anyone who knew about your affair. And I believe she's already dispatched someone to Boston to finish what was started 6 years ago." Andrew was on a ship to Boston within 24 hours. He arrived in South Boston on November 3, 1881, after the fastest Atlantic crossing money could buy. Peter Ashford's contacts had provided an address, a tenement building on D Street where Sarah Eden lived on the 3rd floor. Andrew climbed those stairs in the late afternoon, his heart pounding, rehearsing words that seemed increasingly inadequate. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Let me help." He reached the 3rd floor hallway just as Roy Sutton kicked open the door to Sally's room. Inside, Sallie stood between the intruder and a narrow bed where Clara lay unconscious, her skin flushed with fever. Sallie held a kitchen knife in both hands, the blade shaking violently. "The ring," Roy demanded, his voice flat and professional. "Give me the Thornhill Rose, and I'll make this quick. Fight me, and I'll make sure the child watches you die first." "The ring's gone," Sallie said, her voice breaking. "The jeweler has it. You've got nothing to gain here. Just leave." "Can't do that, Mrs. Eden." Or should I say, Miss Eden? The Duchess wants proof you're dead this time. No more mistakes. Andrew appeared in the doorway behind Roy, rage burning through 10 years of guilt and denial. The only mistake here was mine, Sutton, and I'm correcting it now. Roy spun, gun already drawn. Your Grace. The Duchess sends her regards. What followed was brutal and desperate. Andrew, soft from years of aristocratic life, fought a professional killer in a room barely 10 feet square. Furniture crashed. Clara's fevered whimpers turned to screams. Sallie pressed herself against the wall, shielding her daughter's bed with her body. The gun went off. The bullet punched through the wall, missing Andrew by inches. They struggled toward the doorway, locked together, Roy's fingers searching for the trigger again. At the landing, Andrew made a choice. He could restrain Roy, call the police, do this properly. Instead, he thought of Thomas Ferris's broken body at the bottom of the townhouse stairs. Jonathan Harding's drowned corpse pulled from the Thames. 7 people burned alive in this very neighborhood. Andrew pushed hard. Roy Sutton fell backward down 3 flights of stairs, his neck snapping on the second floor, landing with a sound like a tree branch breaking. Andrew stood at the top, breathing hard, staring at his hands, aristocratic hands that had just killed a man. Then he looked into the room, truly looked, for the first time in 10 years. Sallie was skeletal, her face gaunt and aged beyond her years. Her hands were covered in scars, burns, cuts, the permanent damage of factory work. Her dress was patched and repatched, the fabric so worn it was nearly transparent in places. But her eyes were steel, fierce and unbreaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then, her voice hardening, "Now you can leave. We don't need you." Behind her, Clara struggled to sit up, fever-bright eyes staring at the stranger who'd just killed a man to protect them. She looked exactly like Andrew. The same gray eyes, the same aristocratic bone structure, the same stubborn set to her jaw. "Clara," Sallie said, her voice shaking with a decade of suppressed rage and grief. "This is your father. Don't you dare stop now. Subscribe immediately, because what happens next, the journey back to England, the trial that will destroy the Duchess, and Sally's ultimate choice between revenge and redemption, will leave you absolutely shattered. This is the moment everything changes. Hit that subscribe button and witness the reckoning that's been 10 years in the making." The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. Andrew had booked the entire first-class suite on the SS Britannic, ensuring privacy and the best medical care available. Clara spent most of the voyage in bed, tended by a ship's physician. Andrew paid triple rates to monitor her constantly. The scarlet fever had broken, but she was weak, confused, and terrified of the gray-eyed stranger who claimed to be her father. Sallie watched Andrew with Clara, his awkward attempts at conversation, the expensive dolls and books he'd brought that Clara was too sick to appreciate, his obvious desperate need for her to like him, and felt nothing but cold rage. "You don't get to do this," she told him on the 4th night, finding him outside Clara's cabin. "You don't get to show up after 10 years and play the devoted father." "I know," Andrew said quietly. "But she's dying, Sallie. She needs proper doctors, proper treatment. She needed those things 9 years ago when your payment stopped. She needed them 6 years ago when we were living on the streets after someone tried to burn us alive. Where were you then, Andrew? Where was the devoted father when I was bleeding on factory looms to keep her fed?" Andrew had no answer. He'd spent the voyage learning the truth of their decade, the stopped payments, the grinding poverty, the fire that had killed 7 people, the years of hiding and fear. Each detail was a knife in his chest, and he accepted every cut as deserved. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said finally. "I'm asking for the chance to make it right. Aubrey orchestrated all of it, the stopped payments, the murders, the fire. My solicitor found evidence linking her private accounts to the man I killed in Boston. She's been systematically destroying everyone who knew about you." "Why?" Sallie demanded. "Why does she care? You said your marriage was loveless. You said she wouldn't care about an affair." "The ring," Andrew said. "And succession. Aubrey's barren. She's hidden it for years by blaming me. If I have a child, even illegitimate, it threatens her control over the estates. And the Thornhill Rose. She considers everything in the duchy her property through marriage. You having it enraged her." Sallie laughed bitterly. "I kept that ring as a reminder to hate you properly. Every time I looked at it, I remembered you handing it to me like severance pay. I could have sold it 100 times and saved us years of suffering, but I wanted to remember what you'd done. And now? Andrew asked. Now 7 people are dead because of it. Now my daughter almost died because I finally tried to sell it. So tell me, Your Grace, was protecting your political convenience worth all those lives? Andrew met her eyes. No, nothing was worth that. I was a coward 10 years ago. I chose money and status over you, over our child, and people died because of my cowardice. I can't undo that, but I can stop Aubrey from destroying anyone else. They arrived in London on November 18, 1881. Andrew had sent word ahead to Peter Ashford to prepare legal defenses, but he'd underestimated Aubrey's speed. She was waiting at the Thornhill townhouse with 3 physicians, 2 barristers, and a petition for the Court of Chancery declaring Andrew mentally incompetent. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping false concern as Andrew carried Clara through the door. "Thank God you're home. You've been so unwell, traveling across the Atlantic without telling anyone, bringing this woman and her child into our home. The doctors agree you're having a breakdown." The lead physician stepped forward. "Your Grace, we need to examine you immediately. Your wife reports erratic behavior, paranoid delusions, making wild accusations." "My wife," Andrew said coldly, "has been committing murder for 10 years to hide the fact that I have a daughter. And I can prove it." Aubrey's mask slipped for just a moment, her eyes flashing with pure rage. Then she smiled. "You see, doctors? Delusions. Paranoia. He's brought his former mistress back and now claims I'm some sort of criminal mastermind. It's heartbreaking to watch." The legal war began that night. Aubrey's petition claimed Andrew was suffering from moral insanity brought on by guilt over a past affair, that his recent actions, traveling to America without notice, killing a man in Boston, she'd learned about Roy Sutton's death through her own channels, bringing an alleged illegitimate child to London, proved he was no longer competent to manage the duchy. Her family's money and connections made her formidable. Within days, half of London society had heard the Duchess's version. The poor Duke, driven mad by guilt and grief, manipulated by a scheming American fortune hunter who'd produced a conveniently aged child to claim legitimacy. The newspapers devoured it. The Duke's madness. American mistress returns with bastard child. Duchess battles to save husband from delusion. Cartoons appeared showing Andrew as a doddering fool, Sallie as a harpy with dollar signs in her eyes, Clara as a prop in an elaborate con. Invitations were withdrawn. Former political allies distanced themselves. When Sallie walked through Mayfair with Clara, now recovering slowly but still weak, women crossed the street to avoid them. Men whispered and pointed. Through it all, Peter Ashford worked methodically, building an ironclad case. Bank records, testimonies from Boston authorities, evidence of the stopped payments, documentation of Thomas Ferris's and Jonathan Harding's suspicious deaths. And one more thing, something he'd discovered buried in estate records that would destroy Aubrey completely. The trial was set for January 1882. London waited, breathless, for the scandal of the decade. Sallie sat in the Thornhill townhouse guest room. Andrew had insisted she and Clara stay there despite the scandal, and watched her daughter sleep. Clara still didn't understand what was happening, only that her mother and this stranger who claimed to be her father were fighting a powerful woman who wanted them gone. "We should leave," Clara whispered one night. "Go back to Boston. Hide again. We were safe when we were hiding." Sallie thought of 7 people burned alive, of Thomas Ferris and Jonathan Harding murdered to protect a secret, of 10 years spent running. "No, sweetheart," she said quietly. "We're done hiding. It's time the Duchess learned that some people don't disappear just because you tell them to." The trial began on January 9, 1882, at the Court of Chancery before Lord Justice Pemberton, a stern jurist known for his impatience with both scandal and incompetence. The courtroom was packed, lords and ladies jostling for seats, journalists filling every available space, spectators crammed into the gallery. Aubrey arrived in black silk, playing the role of devoted wife protecting her unstable husband. Her barrister, Sir Charles Thornbury, was vicious and expensive, the man who destroyed 3 political careers and 2 duchesses in recent memory. For 2 weeks, he systematically dismantled Andrew's character. He presented Andrew's history of depression after his failed political career. He called physicians who testified about moral insanity and erotomania, the delusion that women wanted him. He painted Sallie as a calculating seductress who trapped a vulnerable man a decade ago and was now returning to extort money. This woman, Thornberry said, gesturing dismissively at Sallie in the witness box, admits she accepted money from the Duke in 1871. She admits she bore a child out of wedlock. She admits she kept a priceless family heirloom rather than returning it. And now, conveniently desperate and destitute, she returns with a 9-year-old child and claims the Duke is the father. How convenient. How calculated. The cross-examination of Sallie was brutal. Thornberry made her recount every humiliating detail. The affair, the pregnancy, the money she'd accepted, the years of poverty she could have ended by selling the ring. You kept the Thornhill Rose for 10 years, Miss Eden, claiming it was a reminder to hate properly. But isn't the truth simpler? You kept it because you always planned to return and use it as leverage for extortion. No, you admit you tried to sell it only when your daughter became ill, after 10 years of refusing to part with it. I couldn't sell it before. It would have drawn attention. Or perhaps you were waiting for the perfect moment to maximize its value as blackmail. Sallie's hands shook with rage, but she couldn't defend herself effectively. Every answer sounded calculated, every explanation like an excuse. Then came the third week, and Peter Ashford's counterattack. He began with bank records, meticulous documentation of payments authorized by Andrew in 1871, payments that stopped in 1872, and payments falsely reported as continuing by Bartholomew Wright. He showed embezzlement patterns from Wright's accounts, money disappearing and reappearing in untraceable transfers. Then he traced those transfers to Vincent Hale, Aubrey's personal solicitor. "My lord," Peter said, "these payments from the Duchess's private accounts to Mr. Hale occurred 3 times. First, in November 1873, 2 weeks before Thomas Ferris's fatal fall. Second, in February 1874, 1 month before Jonathan Harding drowned in the Thames. Third, in August 1875, 1 week before the boarding house fire in Boston that killed 7 people." The courtroom stirred. Thornberry objected furiously, but Lord Justice Pemberton ordered him to sit down. Peter presented testimony from Boston police about the suspicious fire. A witness who'd seen a large American man watching the building burn. Documentation that Roy Sutton, Aubrey's hired investigator, had been in Boston at the time. Then came the killing blow. "My lord, I call Reverend Duncan MacLeish of St. Giles Kirk, Edinburgh." An elderly Scottish minister took the stand, his weathered face grave. Peter asked simply, "Reverend MacLeish, do you recognize the Duchess of Thornhill?" "Aye," the minister said in a thick Scottish accent. "Though when I married her to Captain Harold Sutherland of the Merchant Navy on June 12, 1855, she gave her name as Miss Aubrey Kensington of York." The courtroom exploded. Aubrey went white, her composure finally cracking. Journalists scribbled furiously. Lord Justice Pemberton's gavel couldn't restore order for a full minute. "Was this marriage ever formally dissolved?" Peter asked. "No, sir. Captain Sutherland died at sea on March 3, 1868, 3 years after the lady's supposed marriage to His Grace the Duke. The marriage certificate is here." He produced the document with trembling hands. Peter turned to the judge. "My lord, the woman calling herself the Duchess of Thornhill has been committing bigamy for 16 years. She was still legally married to Captain Sutherland when she wed the Duke in 1865. Her marriage to the Duke is void. She has no legal standing as his wife, no claim to his estates, no authority to petition for his guardianship, and has been fraudulently collecting income as his legal spouse while actually being nothing more than a criminal impostor." Aubrey stood, her voice shaking with fury. "This is fabricated lies. The parish records from Edinburgh confirm it, Your Grace," Peter said coldly, "as does Captain Sutherland's death certificate filed in Glasgow. Your first husband died 3 years into your bigamous second marriage." Then Peter produced the letter, Andrew's unsent 1872 letter to Sallie, expressing love, anguish, and acknowledgement of their unborn child. He presented Clara to the court, letting the judges and jury see the undeniable resemblance. Andrew's gray eyes, his aristocratic features, his very bearing reflected in this thin, watchful child. Finally, Andrew himself testified. I gave Miss Eden the Thornhill Rose ring and told her to disappear, he said, his voice steady but filled with shame. I abandoned a pregnant woman who trusted me because I was afraid of scandal and afraid of losing my wife's, Miss Kensington's, family fortune. People died because of my cowardice. Thomas Ferris, who served my family for 40 years. Jonathan Harding, a good man with a wife and child. 7 innocent people in Boston who burned to death because this woman, he pointed at Aubrey, wanted to eliminate evidence of my affair and retrieve a ring she had no right to. He looked directly at the judge. I don't deserve forgiveness, my lord. But my daughter deserves acknowledgement, and Miss Eden deserves the position I should have given her 10 years ago. Whatever punishment I've earned, I'll accept. But please, don't let that woman destroy anyone else. Lord Justice Pemberton's ruling came swiftly. The marriage between Andrew Dane, Duke of Thornhill, and Aubrey Kensington is declared void ab initio, invalid from the beginning due to Miss Kensington's existing marriage. Miss Kensington will face criminal charges for bigamy, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and embezzlement. Regarding Miss Clara Eden, there is sufficient evidence to acknowledge her as the natural daughter of the Duke of Thornhill. Should His Grace choose to legitimize her through subsequent marriage to her mother, she would have full inheritance rights under English law. Aubrey was led away in chains, screaming threats and curses, her beautiful mask finally shattered. The Kensington family, humiliated and facing their own legal troubles, disowned her publicly within hours. Outside the courthouse, Sallie held Clara tight while journalists shouted questions. Andrew stood apart, watching them, knowing he'd won the legal battle but still uncertain if he'd ever win back what truly mattered. 6 months after the trial, with Aubrey imprisoned in Millbank and the scandal slowly fading from London's newspapers, Andrew Dane stood in the doorway of the Thornhill Manor drawing room, watching Sallie teach Clara basic estate accounting. His daughter, legally acknowledged now, her name entered in the peerage records, sat beside her mother with a ledger, her small face serious as she traced columns of numbers. Clara had recovered her health under proper medical care, but she remained watchful, uncertain around Andrew despite his patient attempts to connect with her. She called him, Your Grace, with careful formality, never father, never papa. Andrew had spent these months trying to be worthy of them both. He'd established a fund for the families of Thomas Ferris and Jonathan Harding, publicly acknowledging what had happened to them. He'd personally traveled to Boston to meet with survivors of the boarding house fire, offering compensation and apologies that could never be adequate. He'd transferred significant property into Clara's name outright, ensuring her financial independence regardless of what happened next. And he'd waited for Sallie to decide whether she could ever forgive him. We need to talk, he said quietly from the doorway. Sallie looked up, then nodded to Clara. Go find Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, sweetheart. She promised to teach you how to make proper scones. When Clara had gone, Sallie turned to Andrew with those steel eyes that had seen too much. If you're about to propose marriage to legitimize Clara, you can save your breath. Peter Ashford says we can petition Parliament for legitimization without marriage. I know, Andrew said. That's not why I want to talk. He crossed to the window, looking out at the Yorkshire countryside his family had held for generations. You don't have to marry me, Sallie. Clara's legitimacy can be established legally. You don't owe me anything. I'm the one with debts I can never repay. Sallie stood, joining him at the window. She wore a dress he'd had made for her, proper clothing, finally, after 10 years of rags. But she still moved with the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect attacks from any direction. Do you know why I kept that ring? She asked quietly. Why I didn't sell it even when Clara and I were starving? Tell me. Because I was furious. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that you thought you could dismiss me with money and jewelry, that you believed I'd just disappear and never matter again. I kept it as a reminder to hate you properly, to never forget what you'd done. Andrew nodded slowly, accepting this. You earned that hatred. But then, Sallie continued, turning to face him, I watched you with Clara these past months. You're not performing for me or for society. When you teach her about tenant rights and estate management, when you answer her 1,000 questions about inheritance law and agricultural theory, when you braid her hair because she asked you to learn how. That's not the man who told me to disappear. I'm trying to be better, Andrew said. For her. For you. For everyone I failed. Sallie stepped closer, and Andrew saw something in her expression he'd never expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. "I need you to understand something," she said firmly. "If I marry you, I'm not the frightened American girl you seduced and abandoned. I'm not someone you're rescuing. I survived 6 years of poverty and violence that would have broken you. I protected our daughter through things you can't imagine. I'm strong in ways you're not." "I know," Andrew said simply. "So if I accept your proposal, it's as an equal. Clara inherits everything. No conditions, no future sons pushing her aside. I have equal authority over the estates, equal say in every decision. And this ring," she held up her hand, where she'd worn the Thornhill Rose openly since the trial. "This is mine, not the Duchy's. Mine. I earned it through 10 years of hell." Andrew took her hand gently, looking at the ring that had caused so much death and suffering. "It was always yours. I gave it to you for the wrong reasons, but you made it yours through everything you survived. I'd have it no other way." "Then ask me properly," Sallie said, her voice softening slightly. "Not because Clara needs legitimizing, not because society expects it. Ask me because you want me." Andrew Dane, Duke of Thornhill, descended to one knee in the drawing room where his grandmother had once entertained queens. He looked up at the woman who'd been through fire, literal and figurative, and survived. "Sallie Eden, will you marry me? Not because I deserve you, I don't. Not to fix my mistakes, I can't. But because these months with you and Clara have shown me what I lost 10 years ago when I was too much of a coward to fight for it. I'm begging for the chance to spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of you both. Will you let me try?" Sallie let him wait. Let him feel the weight of 10 years of consequences. She'd earned that right. Then, yes. But on one condition. Anything. We tell Clara everything. Every ugly truth. She needs to know who we really were. Your cowardice, my mistakes, Aubrey's evil. So she can choose who she wants to be. She deserves honesty even when it's painful. "Agreed," Andrew said without hesitation. They married quietly in the Thornhill Chapel on a cold March morning in 1882. Clara, age 10, walked her mother down the aisle wearing a new dress, but also carrying Sallie's old factory work gloves tucked into her sash. A reminder, she insisted, of where they'd come from and what they'd survived. The ceremony included a moment where Andrew publicly acknowledged his past failures. The Bishop of Yorkshire, a stern reformer who'd agreed to perform the ceremony only on this condition, required it as part of the marriage vows. "Do you, Andrew Dane, acknowledge the harm you have caused through cowardice and selfishness? And do you commit to spending your remaining days in atonement and service?" "I do," Andrew said clearly. When Clara was asked if she accepted Andrew as her father, she looked at both her parents for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the chapel, "I accept who he's becoming. We're all allowed to become better than we were." 5 years later, in 1886, the transformation was complete. Clara, now 14, was being trained in every aspect of estate management, not as decoration or accomplishment, but as the acknowledged heir who would one day control vast properties. She knew her full history, had visited Boston to meet survivors of the fire and hear their stories, and had developed a fierce commitment to justice that made her parents both proud and slightly terrified. Sallie had transformed the Thornhill estates with reforms inspired by American efficiency and British tradition. She'd built schools for tenant children, established fair wage standards, modernized farming techniques, and earned respect not as the Duke's rescued mistress, but as a formidable administrator whose innovations were being copied across England. Andrew worked alongside her as a true partner, no longer the distant aristocrat, but a man who'd learned humility through consequences. He'd successfully lobbied Parliament for reforms in labor conditions and tenant rights, using his restored political connections for something beyond self-interest. And Aubrey served her sentence in Millbank Prison, 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and bigamy. Her family had disowned her completely. She would leave prison in 1896, penniless and powerless, exactly what she tried to make Sallie. On Clara's 14th birthday, the family stood together in the rose garden where Andrew and Sallie had first fallen in love 16 years earlier. Clara wore the Thornhill Rose ring on a chain around her neck, not on her finger yet, not until she came of age, but close to her heart as a reminder. "Tell me the story again," she asked, as she often did. About the ring and what it means. Sallie and Andrew exchanged glances. They'd promised her honesty, always. Your father gave me this ring and told me to disappear, Sallie said quietly. He was a coward, and I was powerless, and people died because of secrets and shame. But we became better, Andrew added, his hand finding Sallie's. You made us better, Clara. The family we've built, imperfect and scarred and honest, is worth more than any ruby. Clara touched the ring thoughtfully. When I inherit the estates, I'm going to do things differently. No more secrets. No more people treated as disposable. Everyone matters equally. That's what you've taught me. Yes, Sallie said, pulling her daughter close. That's exactly what we've learned. Sometimes the most precious inheritances aren't titles or estates or priceless jewels. They're the courage to survive, the strength to return when you've been dismissed, and the wisdom to forgive without forgetting. The sun set over Yorkshire, painting the gardens gold. A family stood together, built not from tradition or expectation, but from consequences faced, accountability accepted, and the radical choice to believe that people could change, grow, and become worthy of second chances. The Thornhill Rose ring caught the light, glowing like a promise kept, a debt acknowledged, a future earned through fire. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Sallie's survival, Andrew's redemption, and Clara's fierce hope for a better future, then subscribe now. Because stories like this, stories about courage in impossible circumstances, about accountability and transformation, about women who refuse to disappear just because powerful people tell them to. These are the stories that change how we see the world. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is its own kind of victory, and join us for more powerful stories that prove redemption is always possible when we're brave enough to face what we've done and become better. Don't just watch, be part of this community. Subscribe now.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!